Hello everyone, welcome to the 28th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We are entering the last week of this course. In the first week, we have discussed historical location of the idea of development. In the second week, we have discussed the process of decolonization, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. In the third week, we have discussed classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. In the fourth, fifth and sixth weeks, we have discussed modernization theory. In the seventh week, we have discussed critiques of modernization theory. In the eighth week and in the ninth week, we have discussed dependency theory. In the 10th week, we have discussed critiques of dependency theory. In the 11th week, we have discussed limits to growth thesis and small is beautiful. And in the 12th week, we are going to discuss toward a history of needs by Ivan Illich, globalization and development, and then we will discuss Franz J. Surman's paradigms, lost paradigms, regained development studies in the 21st century. Okay, when we look at Ivan Illich's toward a history of needs, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, what Ivan Illich tries to do here, he attempts to focus on the processes through which growing dependence on mass-produced goods and services gradually erodes the conditions necessary for a convivial life, a friendly life. Okay. He was trying to look at industrial mode of production, which refers to the processes through which growing dependence on mass-produced goods and services that gradually erodes the conditions necessary for a convivial life. And in examining a distinct area of economic growth, he demonstrates a general rule. What is that general rule? Now, how use values are inevitably destroyed when the industrial mode of production achieves the predominance that Ivan Illich has termed radical monopoly. We will come to radical monopoly a little while later, but let us stay with how use values are inevitably destroyed in the industrial mode of production. If you look at this, the way industrial growth produces the modernization of poverty, and modernized poverty appears when the intensity of market dependence reaches a certain threshold. Subjectively, it is the experience of frustrating affluence which occurs in persons mutilated by their overwhelming reliance or dependence on the riches of industrial productivity. Simply, modernized poverty deprives those affected by it of their freedom and the power to act autonomously, to live creatively. Modernized poverty also confines them to survival through being plugged into market relations. And precisely because this new importance is so deeply experienced, it is with difficulty expressed. And as you know, we all are witnesses to a variety of barely perceptible transformation in ordinary language by which verbs that formerly designated satisfying actions are replaced by nouns that denote packages designed for passive consumption only. For example, to learn becomes acquisition of credits. A profound change in individual and social self-images is here reflected. And the layman is not the only one who has difficulty in accurately describing what she or he experiences. The professional economist, for example, is unable to recognize the poverty her or his conventional instruments fail to uncover. Nevertheless, the new mutant of impoverishment continues to spread. The peculiarly modern inability to use personal endowments, communal life, environmental resources and so on in an autonomous way infects every aspect of life, where a professionally engineered commodity has succeeded in replacing a culturally sad use value. The opportunity to experience personal and social satisfaction outside the market is destroyed. I mean, what people very often say that no, I am poor, for instance, when the use value of my feet is lost. And this new importance producing poverty must not be confused with the widening gap between the consumption of rich and poor in a world where basic needs are increasingly shaped by industrial commodities. And that gap, what we see, is the form that traditional poverty assumes in an industrial society, and the conventional terms of class struggle appropriately reveal and reduce it. Further, Ivan Illich makes a distinction between modernized poverty and burdensome price exacted by the externalities which increased levels of production spew into the environment. It is clear that these kinds of pollution, stress and taxation are unequally imposed, and correspondingly defenses against such depredations are unequally distributed. Like the new gaps in access, such inequities in social costs are aspects of industrialized poverty for which economic indicators and objective verification can be found. Such is not true for the industrialized impotence that affects both rich and poor. Where this kind of poverty reigns, life without addictive access to commodities is rendered either impossible or criminal. Making do without consumption becomes impossible, not just for the average consumer, but even for the poor. All forms of welfare, from affirmative action to environmental action, are of no help. The liberty to design and craft one's own distinctive dwelling is abolished in favor of the bureaucratic provision of standardization. The organization of employment, skills, building resources, rules and credit favor shelter as a commodity rather than as an activity. Whether the product is provided by an entrepreneur or not, the effective result is the same: citizen impotence, or specifically modern experience of poverty. Wherever the shadow of economic growth touches us, we are left useless. People are left useless, helpless, unless employed on a job or engaged in consumption. The attempt to build a house or a set of bone outside the control of certified specialists appears as anarchic concept. We lose sight of our resources, lose control over the environmental conditions which make the resources applicable, lose taste for self-reliant coping with challenges from without and anxiety from within. When Ivan Illich tries to look at this aspect, that whether the shadow of economic growth touches us or not, or rather wherever the shadow of economic growth touches us, we are left useless or helpless unless employed on a job or engaged in consumption. I mean, people are helpless to recognize evidence unless it has been certified by a professional. Okay. In this way, people also move in circles where the production of babies faithfully reflects the pattern of industrial outputs. Yet, if you as professionally engineered delivery models reach these independent women, for example, the desired competence and conditions for autonomous behavior are being destroyed. For advanced industrial society, the modernization of poverty implies that people are helpless to recognize evidence unless it has been certified by a professional, be she or he a television weather commentator or an educator. The organic discomfort becomes intolerably threatening unless it has been medicalized into dependence on a therapist. The neighbors and friends are lost unless vehicles bridge the separating distance created by the vehicles in the first place, and in short, most of the time we find ourselves out of touch with our world, out of sight of those for whom we work, out of tune with what we feel. When you look at the way Illich tries to look at these elements of tools for conviviality, I mean, that was his first essay that he published in 1973. That is not an essay but a book, Tools for Conviviality in New York. It reflects the changes which have occurred during since the Second World War, both in economic reality and people's perceptions about it. It assumes, this tools of conviviality, it assumes a rather large rise in the non-technical, ritual and symbolic powers of our major technological and bureaucratic systems, and a corresponding fall in their scientific, technical and instrumental effectiveness. For example, in 1968, it was still quite easy to dismiss organized lay resistance to professional dominance as nothing more than a throwback to romantic, obscurantist or elitist fantasies. The grassroots, common sense assessment of technological systems, which were outlined by Illich, seemed childish or retrograde to the political leaders of citizen activism or to the radical professionals who laid claim to the tutorship of the poor by means of their special knowledge. The reorganization of industrial society around professionally defined needs, problems and solutions still was still the commonly accepted value implicit in ideological, political and juridical systems, otherwise clearly and sometimes violently opposed to one another. Now, if you look at today's picture in 2020-21, you will find the picture has changed. Today, a hallmark of advanced and enlightened technical competence is a self-confident community, neighborhood or a group of citizens engaged in the systematic analysis and consequent ridicule of the needs, problems and solutions defined by them by the agents of professional establishments. For example, in the 1960s, 1970s, lay opposition to legislation based on expert opinion still sounded like anti-scientific bigotry. Today, lay confidence in public policies based on experts' opinion is tenuous indeed. Thousands now reach their own judgments and at great cost engage in citizen action without any professional tutorship. They gain the scientific information that they need through personal independent effort, and at times risking limb, freedom and respectability, they bear witness to a newly matured scientific attitude. They know, for example, that the quality and amount of technical evidence sufficiently conclusive to oppose atomic power plants, the multiplication of intensive care units, compulsory education, fetal monitoring, psychosurgery, electroshock treatment or genetic engineering is also simple and clear enough for the layman to grasp and utilize. For example, compulsory schooling, schooling 50 years back was still protected by powerful taboos. Today, its defenders are almost exclusively either teachers whose jobs depend upon it, as Ivan Illich argues, or Marxist ideologues who defend professional knowledge holders in a shadow battle against the hip bourgeois. The myths about the effectiveness of modern medical institutions were still unquestioned. Most economics textbooks accepted the belief that adult life expectancy was increasing, that treatment for cancer postponed death, that the availability of doctors resulted in higher infant survival rates. And since then, people have discovered what vital statistics, population statistics have always shown, that adult life expectancy has not changed in any socially significant way over the last few generations, that it is lower in most rich countries today than in our in the days of yore, and also lower than in many other many poor nations. Universal access to post-secondary schooling, to adult education, to preventive medicine, to highways, to a wired global village was still a prestigious goal. And today, the great myth-making rituals organized around education, transportation, healthcare and urbanization have indeed been partly demystified. They have not yet, however, been disestablished. And then on, how Ivan Illich tries to move on to his reflection on the development decade that he called attention to the exacerbating importance that is inflicted upon the poor in those countries which have benefited most from the importation of the public utilities in which the rich take pride. And then Ivan Illich moves on to focus on the kind of social and political analysis which cripples not just the poor, but the vast majority in the industrialized nations. The production of modernized poverty in the shadow of economic expansion, in the shadow of economic growth, is described principally in the areas of transportation 1, education 2 and healthcare 3. It is from these sectors, namely transportation, education and healthcare, that Ivan Illich has learnt much during has learnt much from his social and political analysis. Shadow prices and increased consumption gaps are important aspects of the new poverty, but Ivan Illich's principal interest is directed toward a different concomitant of modernization. What is that? A different concomitant of modernization. That is directed that refers to the process by which autonomy is undermined, satisfaction dulled, experience flattened out and needs frustrated for nearly everyone. For example, Ivan Illich has examined society-wide obstacles to mutual presence which are necessary side effects of energy intensive importation, transportation, and he also wanted to define the power limits of motors, for example, equitably used to increase people's access to one another. He also recognized, of course, that high speeds inevitably impose a skewed distribution of harriedness, noise, pollution and enjoyment of privilege. But the way he emphasized on I mean the way he argues which are focused on the negative internalities of modernity, that is time consuming acceleration, sick making healthcare and stupefying education. The unequal distribution of the benefits or the unequal imposition of their negative externalities are corollaries to his basic argument, and he is more interested in the direct and specific effects of modernized poverty in human tolerance for such effects and in the possibility of escaping the new misery. What Ivan Illich has found through his research toward a history of needs, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that he found it necessary to examine again and again the correlation between the nature of tools on the one hand and the meaning of justice that prevails in the society that uses them on the other. He observed the decline of freedom in societies where rights are set by expertise. He had to weigh the trade-offs between new tools that enhance the production of commodities and those equally modern ones that permit the generation of values in use, use values, between rights to mass produced commodities and the level of liberty that permits satisfying and creative personal expression, between paid employment and useful unemployment, and in each dimension of the trade-off between heteronomous management and autonomous action. Ivan Illich found that the language that would permit us to insist on the latter, autonomous action, must be recovered with difficulty. And that is how Ivan Illich seeks the audience committed to a radically equitable access to goods, rights and jobs, that he found it almost unnecessary to insist on our struggle for this side of justice, okay, as in contradistinction with Marxism. What he found it much more important and difficult to deal with its complement, the politics of conviviality. That is why he used the term tools for conviviality, to designate the struggle for an equitable distribution of the liberty to generate use values, and for the instrumentation of this liberty through the assignment of an absolute poverty to the production of those industrial and professional commodities that confer on the least advantaged the greatest power to generate values in use. Now, convivial politics, which is based on the insight that in a modern society both wealth and jobs can be equitably shared and enjoyed in liberty only when both are limited by a political process. Excessive forms of wealth and prolonged formal employment, no matter how well distributed, destroy the social, cultural and environmental conditions for equal productive freedom. Bits and watts, which here stand for units of information and of energy respectively, when packaged into a mass produced commodity in amounts that pass a threshold, inevitably constitute impoverishing wealth. And such wealth is either too rare to be shared, or it is destructive of the freedom and liberty of the weakest. And toward a history of needs, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, Ivan Illich has attempted to make a contribution to the political process by which the socially critical thresholds of enrichment are recognized by citizens and translated into society-wide ceilings or limits. And as we have discuss the basics of toward a history of needs by Ivan Illich, where he was trying to look at industrial mode of production, which refers to the process through which growing dependence on mass produced goods and services gradually erodes the conditions necessary for convivial life, and how in when the industrial mode of production achieves the predominance, how use values are inevitably destroyed, which Ivan Illich has termed radical monopoly. Now, let us see what radical monopoly is all about. I mean, erosion of use values are getting eroded in the context of radical monopoly, and if you look at this, that use values are getting eroded in the industrial mode of production, I mean reduction of use values to commodities, I mean the process of commodification. Then everything is considered in terms of a commodity which can be bought and sold in the market, and which has got more exchange value. Okay, that is how use values are getting eroded, and that is the ideology in capitalist societies. The real underlying relationships are hidden from our perception, and that we build our understanding of the world only in terms of appearances. And industrial capitalism entails manufacture by means of a factory system with 4 elements. 1, an intricate division of labor or specialization within and between work processes. 2, the creation of designated workplaces and factories. 3, de-skilling of traditional handicraft skills. And 4, the routinization of work tasks. Ivan Illich regards so-called economic development as in reality leading to the destruction of the vernacular skills previously possessed by people in self-sufficient pre-industrial societies, economies. Further, Ivan Illich argues that people have become increasingly dependent on professionals, experts and specialists for satisfaction of many of their fundamental needs, such as the provision of health services and compulsory schooling. The provision of such services as health services and compulsory schooling has often become radical monopoly, since with the destruction of earlier traditions there is often no longer any alternative but to have recourse to such expert provision, and in many ways the services offered by such experts are debilitating and dehumanizing, leading to passive consumption and dependency. A professionally engineered commodity has succeeded in replacing a culturally shared use value, and that is how your tradition also gets destroyed. Ivan Illich distinguishes modernized poverty from the burdensome price exacted by the externalities which increased levels of production spew into the environment. That is what we have discussed. And from advanced industrial society, the modernization of poverty implies that people are helpless to recognize evidence unless it has been certified by a professional. And the way Ivan Illich looked at principally the 3 areas of transportation, education and healthcare. I mean if you look at the energy sector, the aspect of equity, sustainability and so on. We are going to discuss in terms of how radical alternatives to industrial society, I mean low energy, convivial modernity, under some circumstances a technology incorporates the values of the society for which it was invented to such a degree that these values become dominant in every society which applies that technology. And the material structure of products and devices can irremediably incorporate class bias and high energy technology. Then we will discuss industrialization of traffic, speed stunt, imagination, net transfer of lifetime, ineffectiveness of acceleration, the radical monopoly of industry and so on. Let us start one by one. From the energy crisis that Ivan Illich tries to look at here, that it has recently become fashionable to insist on an impending energy crisis, and this euphemistic term conceals a contradiction and involves an illusion. It masks the contradiction implicit in the joint pursuit of equity and industrial growth. It safeguards the illusion that machine power can indefinitely take the place of manpower. To resolve this contradiction and dispel this illusion, it is urgent to clarify the reality that the language of crisis obscures high quantum of energy degrades social relations just as inevitably as they destroy the physical milieu. The advocates of an energy crisis believe in and continue to propagate a peculiar vision of human beings, of individuals. According to such notion, according to the advocates of an energy crisis, that individuals are born into perpetual dependence on slaves, which they must painfully learn to master. If they do not employ prisoners, then they need machines to do most of their work. According to this doctrine, the well-being of a society can be measured by the number of years its members have gone to school and by the number of energy slaves they have thereby learned to command. And this belief is common to the conflicting economic ideologies now in vogue. It is threatened by the obvious inequity, hurriedness and the impotence that appear everywhere once the voracious hordes of energy slaves outnumber people by a certain proportion. The energy crisis focuses concern on the scarcity of fodder for these slaves, and Ivan Illich prefers to ask whether free men need them, free individuals need them. The energy policies adopted during, adopted in the 1970s, 80s, and we talk about biofuels today, energy sector. We talk about Jatropha as an alternative source of energy production and so on, biofuels production and so on, which would determine the range and character of social relationships in a society that will be able to enjoy maybe after 50 years or 100 years, but we do not know. That is why Ivan Illich argues that a low energy policy allows for a wide choice of lifestyles and cultures. If on the other hand a society opts for high energy consumption, its social relations must be dictated by technocracy and will be equally degrading whether labeled capitalist or socialist. At this moment, most societies, especially the poor ones, are still free to set their energy policies by any of three guidelines. Well-being can be identified with high amounts of per capita energy use, 1, with 2, with high efficiency of energy transformation, and 3, or with the least possible use of mechanical energy by the most powerful members of society. The first approach, that is the high amounts of per capita energy use, would stress tight management of scarce and limited and destructive fuels on behalf of industry, whereas the second one, that with high efficiency of energy consumption, would emphasize the retooling of industry in the interest of thermodynamic thrift. And these first two attitudes, that high amounts of per capita energy use on the one hand and high efficiency of energy transformation on the other, necessarily imply huge public expenditures and increased social control. Both rationalize the emergence of a computerized Leviathan, and both are at present widely discussed. The possibility of a third option, that with the least possible use of mechanical energy by the most powerful members of society, this is barely noticed. While people have begun to accept ecological limits on maximum per capita energy use as a condition for physical survival, they do not yet think about the use of minimum feasible power as the foundation of any of various social orders that would be both modern and desirable. Yet only a ceiling on energy use can lead to social relations that are characterized by high levels of equity. The one option that is at present neglected is the only choice within the reach of all nations. It is also the only strategy by which a political process can be used to set limits on the power of even the most motorized bureaucrat. Participatory democracy postulates low energy technology, and only participatory democracy creates the conditions for rational technology. What is generally overlooked is that equity and energy can grow concurrently only to a point. Below a threshold of per capita wattage, motors improve wattage, motors improve the conditions for social progress, and above this threshold, energy grows at the expense of equity. Further, energy affluence then implies decreased distribution of control over that energy. The widespread belief that clean and abundant energy is the panacea for social ills is due to a political fallacy, according to which equity and energy consumption can be indefinitely correlated, at least under some ideal political conditions. Laboring under this illusion, we tend to discount any social limit on the growth of energy consumption. But if ecologists, for example, are right to assert that non-metabolic power pollutes, it is in fact just as inevitable that beyond a certain threshold, mechanical power corrupts. The threshold of social disintegration by high energy quanta is dependent from or is independent from the threshold at which energy conversion produces physical destruction. And you will find that expressed in horsepower, for example, it is undoubtedly lower. This is the fact which must be theoretically recognized before a political issue can be made of the per capita wattage to which a society would limit its members. Even if non-polluting power were feasible and abundant, the use of energy on a massive scale acts on society like a drug that is physically harmless but psychically enslaving. A community can choose between maintaining its addiction to alien energy and kicking its painful cramps, but no society can have a population that is hooked on progressively larger numbers of energy slaves whose members are also autonomously active. Even Illich thus demonstrates that beyond a certain level of per capita gross national product, the cost of social control must rise faster than total output and become the major institutional activity within an economy. Therapy administered by educators, psychiatrists and social workers must converge with the designs of planners, managers and salesmen and complement the services of security agencies, the military and the police. He indicates one reason why increased affluence requires increased control over people. He argues that, Ivan Illich argues that beyond a certain median per capita energy level, the political system and cultural context of any society must decay. Once the critical quantum of per capita energy is surpassed, education for the abstract goals of a bureaucracy must supplant the legal guarantees of personal and concrete initiative, and this quantum is the limit of social order. Further, Illich argues that technocracy must prevail as soon as the ratio of mechanical power to metabolic energy oversteps a definite identifiable threshold. The order of magnitude within which this threshold lies is largely independent of the level of technology applied. Yet its very existence has slipped into the blind spot of social imagination in both rich as well as medium rich countries. I mean, a section of the population you may find that can be just as dangerously as overpowered by the wattage of its tools or by the caloric content of its foods. But it is much harder to confess to a national overindulgence in wattage than to a sickening diet. The per capita wattage, for example, that is critical for social well-being lies within an order of magnitude which is far above the horsepower known to the 4/5 of humanity and far below the power commanded by any driver. Okay? Any driver of top-notch motor vehicles. Okay. It eludes the under-consumer and the over-consumer alike. Neither is willing to face the facts, but for the primitive, the elimination of slavery and drudgery depends on the introduction of appropriate modern technology, and for the rich, the avoidance of an even more horrible degradation that depends on the effective recognition of a threshold in energy consumption beyond which technical processes begin to dictate social relations. Calories are both biologically and socially healthy only as long as they stay within the narrow range that separates enough from too much. The so-called energy crisis is then a politically ambiguous issue. Public interest in the quantity of power and in the distribution of controls over the use of energy can lead in two opposite directions. On the one hand, questions can be posed that would open the way to political reconstruction by unblocking the search for a post-industrial, labor-intensive, low-energy and high-equity economy. And on the other hand, historical concern with machine fodder can reinforce the present escalation of capital-intensive institutional growth and carry us past the last turn-off from a hyper-industrial event. And political reconstruction presupposes the recognition of the fact that there exist critical per capita quanta beyond which energy can no longer be controlled by political process. A universal social straitjacket will be the inevitable outcome of ecological restraints on total energy imposed by industrial minded planners bent on keeping industrial production at some hypothetical maximum. The choice of a minimum energy economy compels the poor to abandon fantastical expectations and the rich to recognize their vested interest as a ghastly liability. Both must reject the fatal image of the individual, the slaveholder currently promoted by an ideologically stimulated hunger for more energy. In countries that were made affluent by industrial development, the energy crisis serves as a pretext for raising the taxes that would be needed to substitute new, more rational and socially more deadly industrial processes for those that have been rendered obsolete by inefficient overexpansion. And for the leaders of people who are not yet dominated by the same process of industrialization, the energy crisis serves as a historical imperative to centralize production, pollution and their control in a last ditch effort to catch up with the more highly powered. By exporting their crisis, and by preaching the new gospel of Puritan energy worship, the rich do even more damage to the poor than they did by selling them the products of now outdated factories. As soon as a poor country accepts the doctrine that more energy, more carefully managed would always yield more goods for more people, the country locks itself into the cage of enslavement to maximum industrial outputs. Inevitably, the poor lose the option for rational technology when they choose to modernize their poverty by increasing their dependence on energy. Inevitably, the poor deny themselves the possibility of liberating technology and participatory politics when, together with maximum feasible energy use, they accept maximum feasible social control. The energy crisis thus cannot be overwhelmed by more energy inputs. It can only be dissolved along with the illusion that well-being depends on the number of energy slaves an individual has at his or her command. For this purpose, it is necessary to identify the thresholds beyond which energy corrupts, and to do so by a political process that associates the community in the search for limits. Because this kind of research runs counter to that now done by experts and for institutions. It has 3 steps as pointed out by Ivan Illich. First, the need for limits on the per capita use of energy must be theoretically recognized as a social imperative. Then the range must be, second one, the range must be located wherein the critical magnitude must be found. And thirdly, each community has to identify the levels of inquiry, hearing and operant conditioning that its members are willing to accept in exchange for the satisfaction that comes of idealizing powerful devices and joining in rituals directed by the professionals who control their operation. The need for political research on socially optimal energy quanta can be clearly and concisely illustrated. Okay? That is how Ivan Illich tries to look at the industrialization of traffic, for example. Okay? In traffic, energy used over a specific period of time, power, translates into speed, and in this case the critical quantum would appear as a speed limit. Wherever this limit has been passed, the basic pattern of social degradation by high energy quantum has increased. Okay? And in this way, the discussion of how energy is used to move people requires a formal distinction between transport and transit as the 2 components of traffic. By traffic, Ivan Illich meant any movement of people from one place to another when they are outside their homes. By transit, he meant those movements that put human metabolic energy to use, and by transport, that mode of movement which relies on other sources of energy, and these energy sources would henceforth be mostly motors. Such animals compete fiercely with human beings for their food in an overpopulated world, unless they are thistle eaters like donkeys and camels. That is what, in a humorous way, Ivan Illich puts it. As soon as people become tributaries of transport, not just when they travel for several days, but also on their daily trips, the contradictions between social justice and motorized power, between effective movement and higher speed, between personal freedom and engineered routing become poignantly clear. Enforced dependence on automobile machines then denies the community of self-propelled people just those values supposedly procured by improved transportation. people have well on their feet, this primitive means of getting around will on closer analysis appear quite effective when compared with a lot of people in modern cities or on industrialized farms. It would appear particularly attractive once it has been understood that perhaps for example modern American, modern European, modern Indian walks on the average as many miles as their ancestors, most of them through tunnels, corridors, parking lots and stores. Okay. Coming to speed stunt imagination, I mean past a certain threshold of energy consumption, the transportation industry dictates the configuration of social space. Motorways expand, driving wedges between neighbors and removing fields beyond the distance a farmer can walk. Ambulances take clinics beyond the few miles a sick child can be carried. The doctor would no longer come to the house because vehicles have made the hospital into the right place to the sick. Once heavy trucks reach a village high, then you will find that the local market would disappear. Equal speeds have equally distorting effects on the perception of space, time and personal potency in rich as well as in poor countries. Nevertheless, different the surface appearances might be. Everywhere the transportation industry shapes a new kind of individual to fit the new geography and the new schedules of its making. The product of the transportation industry is the habitual passenger who has been boosted out of the world in which people still move on their own, and they have lost the sense that they stand at the center of this world. And the habitual passenger is conscious of the exacerbating time scarcity that results from daily recourse to the cars, trains, buses, subways and elevators that force them to cover an average of 20 miles every day, frequently crisscrossing their path within a radius of less than 5 miles. They have been lifted off their feet. No matter if they go by subway or jet plane, they feel slower and poorer than someone else and resents the shortcuts taken by the privileged few who can escape the frustrations of traffic. If they are cramped by the timetable of their commuter train, they dream of a car. If they drive exhausted by the rush hour, they envy the speed capitalists who drive against the traffic. If they must pay for their car out of their own pocket, they know fully well that the commanders of corporate fleets send the fuel bill to the company and write off the rented car as a business expense. The habitual passenger is thus caught at the wrong end of growing inequality, time scarcity and personal impotence, but they can see no way out of this blind except to demand more of the same, more traffic by transport. They stand in wait for technical changes in the design of vehicles, roads and schedules, or else they expect a revolution to produce mass rapid transport under public control. In neither case do they calculate the price of being halted into a better future. They forget that they are the ones who would pay the bill either in fares or in taxes. They overlook the hidden cost of replacing private cars with equally rapid public transport. The habitual passengers thus cannot grasp the folly of traffic based overwhelmingly on transport. They inherited perceptions of space and time and of personal pace have been industrially deformed. They have lost the power to conceive of themselves outside the passenger role. Addicted to being carried along, they have lost control over the physical, social and psychic powers that reside in individuals' feet. The passengers have come to identify territory with the untouchable landscape through which they are rushed. They have become important to establish their domain, mark it with their imprint and assert their sovereignty over it. They have lost confidence in their power to admit others into their presence and to share space consciously with them. They can no longer face the remote by themselves, let on their own they feel immobile. The habitual passengers must adopt a new set of beliefs and expectations if they are to feel secure in the strange world where both liaisons and loneliness are products of conveyance. And to gather for them means to be brought together by vehicles. They come to believe that political power grows out of the capacity of the transportation system and in its absence is the result of access to the television screen. They take freedom of movement to be the same as their claims on propulsion. They believe that the level of democratic process correlates to the power of transportation and communication systems. They have lost faith in the political power of the feet and of the tongue. As a result, what they want is not more liberty as a citizen, but better service as a client. They do not insist on their freedom to move and to speak to people, but on their claim to be sipped and to be informed by the media. They want a better product rather than freedom from servitude to it. It is vital that they come to see that the acceleration that they demand is self-defeating and that it must result in a further decline of equity, leisure and autonomy. The net transfer of lifetime, that unchecked speed is expensive and progressively fewer can afford it. Each increment in the velocity of a vehicle results in an increase in the cost of propulsion and track construction, and most dramatically in the space the vehicle devours while it is on the move past a certain threshold of energy consumption. For the fastest passenger, a worldwide class structure of speed capitalists is created. That is what we have discussed. I mean, the material structure of products and devices can irremediably incorporate class bias, class hierarchy, class prejudice. Okay. The exchange value of time becomes dominant, and this is reflected in language. Time is spent, saved, invested, wasted and employed. As societies put price tags on time, equity and vehicular speed correlate inversely. High speed capitalizes a few people's time at an enormous rate, but if you look at it paradoxically, it does this at a high cost in time for all. For example, in Mumbai, in Delhi, in metropolitan cities, you will find only a very few people who own cars. They can reach a provincial capital in one morning and make the trip once a week. I mean, people may own cars, but they do not drive so frequently because of traffic. The ineffectiveness of acceleration, I mean, it should not be overlooked that top speeds for a few exact different price than high speeds for all. Social classification by levels of speed enforces a net transfer of power, that is, the poor work and pay to get left behind. But if the middle classes of a speed society may be tempted to ignore discrimination, they should not neglect the rising marginal disutilities of transportation and their own loss of leisure. High speeds for all imply that everybody has less time for themselves, as the whole society spends a growing slice of its time budget on moving people. vehicles running over the critical speed not only tend to impose inequality, they also inevitably establish a self-serving industry that hides an inefficient system of locomotion under apparent technological sophistication. Okay? The radical monopoly of industry, that a desirable ceiling on the velocity of movement cannot be usefully discussed without returning to the distinction between self-powered transit and motorized transport and comparing the contribution each component makes relative to the total locomotion of people, which Ivan Illich has called traffic. And transport stands for the capital intensive mode of traffic, and transit indicates a labor intensive mode. Transport is the product of an industry whose clients are passengers. It is an industrial commodity and therefore scarce by definition. Improvement of transport always takes place under conditions of scarcity that become more severe as the speed and with it the cost of the service increases. Conflict about insufficient transport tends to take the form of a zero-sum game where one wins only if another loses. And transit, on the contrary, is not the product of an industry but the independent enterprise of transients. It has use value by definition but need not have any exchange value. The ability to engage in transit is native to individuals and more or less equally distributed amongst healthy people of the same age. The exercise of this ability can be restricted by depriving some class of people of the right to take a straight route, or because a population lacks shoes or pavements. Conflict about unsatisfactory transit conditions tends to take therefore the form of non-zero sum game in which everyone comes out ahead, not only the people who get the right to walk through a formerly walled property but also those who live along the road. Total traffic is the result of two profoundly distinct modes of production, and these can reinforce each other harmoniously only as long as the autonomous outputs are protected against the encroachment of the industrial product. Then what Ivan Illich is trying to do here, he is trying to look at the elusive threshold, the degrees of self-powered mobility, the dominant versus subsidiary motors and so on in the context of under-equipment, overdevelopment and mature technology. And if you look at this, I mean, liberation which comes cheap to the poor will cost the rich dear, but they will pay its price once the acceleration of their transportation systems grinds traffic to a halt. A concrete analysis of traffic betrays the truth underlying the energy crisis, that is the impact of industrially packaged quanta of energy on the social environment tends to be degrading, exhausting and enslaving, and these effects come into play even before those which threaten the pollution of the physical environment and the extinction of the race. The crucial point at which these effects can be reversed is not nevertheless a matter of deduction but of decision. Okay. Then what we have discussed in this lecture, we have discussed toward a history of needs, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. From industrial mode of production, which refers to the process through which growing dependence on mass produced goods and services gradually erodes the conditions necessary for a convivial life, how huge values are inevitably getting destroyed when the industrial mode of production achieves the predominance that even Ivan Illich has termed radical monopoly. We have discussed modernized poverty that appears when the intensity of market dependence reaches a certain threshold, and modernized poverty, how it deprives those affected by it for their freedom and power to act autonomously, to live creatively, how it confines them to survival through being plugged into market relations. Then we have discussed how pollution, stress and taxation are unequally imposed, and correspondingly defenses against such depredations are unequally distributed. And we have discussed tools for conviviality, grassroots common sense assessment of technological systems, reorganization of industrial society, and then we have discussed negative internalities of modernity, I mean in terms of time consuming acceleration, sick making healthcare and stupefying education, correlation between the nature of tools on the one hand and the meaning of justice on the other, decline of freedom, radical monopoly, energy and equity, how radical alternatives to industrial society, I mean in terms of low energy and convivial modernity. Under some circumstances, technology incorporates the values of our economy, culture and polity, for which it was invented to such a degree that these values become more dominant in every society which applies that technology. And the material structure of products and devices can irremediably incorporate class bias. We have discussed this. Then we have discussed in terms of energy and equity, industrialization of traffic, speed stunt, imagination, net transfer of lifetime, ineffectiveness of acceleration, the radical monopoly of industry. Then we have if you look at this, the elusive threshold degrees of self-powered mobility, dominant versus subsidiary motors in the context of under-equipment, over-development and mature technology. And in the next lecture, what we are going to do, we are going to, we are left with 2 more lectures. We are going to discuss Paradigms Lost, Paradigms Regained, Development Studies in the 21st Century by Franz J. Surman. Thank you.